Hi John, hey Jaguars, this is Miss Schooler with Soof by Sarah Weeks. We are on chapter 13 called More Than a Broom Loves to Sweep. Are we going to get in trouble? I asked as my mother unlocked the front door. No, she said, stepping inside. We came into the house once before, and as long as we don't go upstairs, I don't see any reason why we can't be here now. They've already started work on the roof, and it's still completely covered. Besides, we're not planning to stay long. There were dark streaks of soot on the walls, plaster peeled from the ceiling where it had gotten wet. What's that awful smell? I asked, wrinkling my nose. Mildew, my mother said, and smoke. It's going to be a big job cleaning this mess up. My room looked pretty much the same as it had before the fire, except for the dirty walls and a broken window, which had been covered over with a sheet of plywood. The black dots where I'd tapped with my broom handle were still on the ceiling, but the covers had been stripped off the bed and sent to the cleaners. There was a pink sock lying on the mattress, the one I had put the lighter inside before I'd hidden it. That seemed like 1,000,000 years ago. So much had happened since then. None of it good. There were several pictures of duck pinned to the bulletin board over my desk. Luckily, none of them had been harmed. I couldn't decide which one would be best for the flyer, so I took them all down and went out to the kitchen to find a plastic bag to put them in. My mother was standing on a step stool, removing the kitchen curtains. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked as she unhooked the last ring and tossed the curtains into a wicker laundry basket, along with her yellow apron and a bunch of dish towels, all of which she planned to wash later at Scott and Julie's. Duck's rug, the one he always slept on, was lying on the floor. I picked it up and handed it to my mother. "We need to wash this too," I said, "for when he comes home." She nodded and put it in the basket. After we'd thrown everything in the car, I asked my mother to wait while I went around back and whistled for Duck in case he was nearby. "Here, boy," I called. "Here, Duck." But the only response I got was a raspy scolding from a blue jay watching from a nearby tree. If there was a silver lining to be found in my sorry situation, it was that Heidi would no longer be coming to visit. We couldn't very well have company when we didn't even have a house to have company in. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to share my room with her, but mostly I was relieved I wouldn't have to meet her. Knowing what I knew now about my mother's feelings about her, I would be happy never to have to lay eyes on her at all. The next morning, Julie helped me make a new flyer, using one of the photographs I'd brought back from the house. It was a picture I'd taken of Duck the day I'd bought his red collar. We made a bunch of copies at the library, and that evening after my father got home from work, he and I drove all around Liberty, stapling and taping up flyers. We got a grand total of 3 calls over the next few weeks, but they all turned out to be false alarms. I kept checking with the animal shelter until finally they asked me not to call anymore. They promised they would let me know if Duck showed up. My 15 minutes of fame were over at school, and most of the kids had gone back to ignoring me. Excuse me. Christy and Joanne were still trying to be nice, inviting me to sit with them at lunch if I wanted to. But I could never think of anything to say to them, and after a while, they stopped saving me a seat. Every time I ran into Mrs. Strawgate in the hall, she'd remind me that her door was always open. But I didn't feel like talking to her either. One day, Mr. Taylor taught us how to make book spine poetry. And after that, I spent a lot of my time in the school library pulling books off the shelves and stacking them up to make poems out of their titles. I even made one about Duck. One good dog, a wrinkle in time, out of my mind, wish. I had tried to find books with the word duck in the title, but the only ones I could come up with were The Ugly Duckling and Duck for President, neither of which worked. While I'd been searching the shelves for my poems, I rediscovered the Boxcar Children series and checked out a whole stack. Those stories had been some of the very first chapter books I'd ever read, and there was something comforting about spending time with the Alden kids again, even though the boys seemed to have more than their share of the adventures while the girls stayed home and did dishes. Scott had patched the leaky air mattress, so I'd been sleeping a little better. During the day, while I was at school, my mother spent her time over at our house, overseeing the parade of painters and carpenters who came and went like ants at a picnic. On weekends, we would all go over there together, and while my parents worked on the house, I would look for Duck. We stayed with Scott and Julie for a total of 3 weeks, and when we finally moved back home, things got a little better between my mother and me. It takes a lot of energy to stay mad at someone, even if you have a good reason. The house was coming together nicely. My room had a new window and a fresh coat of paint. The dots on the ceiling were gone. We were still waiting for some furniture to be delivered, including a new couch, and the carpet needed to be installed, but life was beginning to feel almost normal again, as normal as it could, without Duck, anyway. Then one day my mother got another letter from Heidi. "Good news," she said when she'd finished reading it. "Heidi will be here next Sunday." I couldn't believe my ears. "Why is she still coming?" I said. "Didn't you tell her about the fire? We don't even have a couch for her to sit on." "She won't mind if things aren't perfect," my mother told me. "And with the baby coming in July, it's pretty much now or never." Never sounded just fine to me. "I'm not sharing my room with her," I protested. "I don't even know her, and besides..." "Besides what?" my mother asked. "Bip bam bash boom," I said, pounding a fist into my palm. "Translation, please," my mother said. "You figure it out," I told her, and then I went to my room, slamming the door behind me. The photos of Duck were back on the bulletin board, and my mother had made me a new pair of curtains with flowers and butterflies all over them. At first, I had loved the way they looked, like a meadow hanging in my window. Now I wondered if she'd made them for me, or if they were really for Heidi. My father was late coming home that night, so my mother and I ate together at the kitchen table. I pushed a breaded chicken cutlet around my plate for a while, then asked to be excused so I could get started on my homework. We were reading Esperanza Rising in class. I was pretty sure Mr. Taylor had chosen the book especially for me, because Esperanza's house catches on fire in the story. Once upon a time, I had wondered why so many books written for kids are about sad things. But now I understood that sometimes it helps to know that sad things happen to other people too, even if they're not real. Later, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard my father come home. I rinsed out my toothbrush and walked down the hall to say hello. He was out in the living room with my mother, who was sitting in a chair with her back to me. She was cradling something in her arms, rocking it like a baby as she wept. "Don't cry, Rube," my father told her, kneeling down beside her. "We can get another." I held my breath as he reached for whatever it was she was holding. "I don't want another," she said. "It won't be the same." It wasn't until he stood up that I could see that he had Heidi's jelly bean jar in his hands. The fire had cracked the glass and melted the beans into a single gooey mass. She was right. It wouldn't ever be the same. That night, I had another dream about Duck. He was sound asleep on his rug in the kitchen, and when I came in, he opened his eyes and wagged just the tip of his tail. I lay down beside him on the floor, put my arms around him, pressing my nose into one of his soft black ears. When I woke up, I was hugging my pillow, and I swore I could still smell popcorn. I closed my eyes and tried to climb back into the dream, but it didn't work, so I lay there crying in the dark instead. There was an ache deep down inside me, like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Back when I was in kindergarten, my mother had explained that the pains I felt in my stomach sometimes when I was at school were called homesickness. Only the home I'd been missing then was a little white house where a black dog with a red collar lived, along with a handsome father in a big gray hat and a doting mother in a yellow apron who loved her daughter more than anyone else in the world. The little white house was still there. It even had a brand new roof, but all the colors inside it were gone because the family that used to live there didn't exist anymore. That's the end of chapter 13. I bet you heard some familiar titles of books in that chapter. I believe we have all of these books in our library. One Good Dog, I believe, is by Larson. Can't remember what her first name is. Wrinkle in Time, of course, you know that one by Madeline L'Engle. Out of My Mind, that's one by Sharon Draper. And Wish, I think that's by Catherine Applegate, that book. And then Esperanza Rising. These are all really good books if you haven't read them. So we'll see you for chapter 14 next time.